Let's talk about something we run into all the time, the interview. But what is it really? Is it a genuine search for truth and art form? Or is it basically just an assault on someone's privacy?
So, here's the plan. We're going to start by digging into that central question, art or assault. Then, we'll see why so many famous people absolutely despised being interviewed, before looking at why it's such a powerful medium. And we'll wrap up with a really cool case study, a look at an interview with the brilliant Umberto Eco, to see what we can learn from him.
You know, ever since the interview was invented, maybe 130 years ago, it's been this huge point of contention. People either see it as the best way to communicate or as the absolute worst kind of intrusion. There's not a lot of middle ground.
And to really get a feel for how much some people hate it, just listen to this from the novelist Saul Bellow. He said, being interviewed felt like having thumbprints on his windpipe. Wow. I mean, that's such a powerful, violent image, isn't it?
Okay, so this really breaks it down for us. You've got these two totally opposite camps. On one side, it's an art form, a noble source of truth. But on the other, it's seen as an intrusion that actually diminishes the person being interviewed, kind of like that old idea that a photograph could steal a piece of your soul.
All right, let's really dig into that negative side of things for a minute. Why did so many brilliant, celebrated people, especially writers, feel like they were victims when they sat down with an interviewer?
Well, take someone like Lewis Carroll. He had what was called a just horror of the interviewer. For him, it was about being lionized, being turned into this public figure. He hated the thought of fame so much that he just said no to every single interview request.
And then you have Rudyard Kipling, who took it to a whole other level. He didn't just find it annoying, he thought it was immoral, a crime. He literally put it on the same level as being physically assaulted.
But, and this is a great little twist, the very same Kipling who called interviewing a crime had actually interviewed Mark Twain himself just a few years earlier. So, he was basically guilty of the very assault he was condemning. It just goes to show you how messy this whole thing is.
So, if all these big names hated it so much, why didn't it just disappear? Well, because love it or hate it, the interview has become one of the most powerful ways we communicate in the modern world. It's undeniable.
As the writer Dennis Bryan said, it's how we form our sharpest impressions of the people shaping our culture. And when you stop and think about it, he's right. Almost everything we learn about important people comes to us through this format of one person asking another questions.
And this is the central paradox, right? H.G. Wells called it an ordeal, but he sat for interviews all the time. He even interviewed Joseph Stalin. And Saul Bellow, the guy with the thumbprints on his windpipe, he still did them. Why? Because they understood its power and influence.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the theory. Now let's look at a real-world example of someone who was a master of the interview, the incredible Italian scholar and novelist Umberto Eco.
Now, what you've got to remember about Eco is that before he was a famous novelist, he was already a huge deal in the academic world. I mean, a total intellectual rock star, a professor with this massive reputation for his work on some really complex stuff.
And then, bam, 1980 happens. His very first novel, The Name of the Rose, goes on to sell more than 10 million copies. This wasn't just a bestseller. It launched him into a kind of global superstardom that very few academics ever get to see.
So, of course, people were fascinated. In one interview, someone asked him, how on earth do you do it all? The dense academic books, the newspaper columns, the best-selling novels. And Eco's answer is just fantastic.
He starts with this wild analogy. He says, imagine you could just suck all the empty space out of the universe. What would be left? The whole universe would shrink down to the size of your fist.
He has a name for these little gaps of time in our lives, interstices. It's the time you're waiting for an elevator to arrive, or you're in a cab, or you're waiting for someone to get on a call. We all have tons of these little empty spaces in our day.
And here's how he puts it into practice. He literally says to the interviewer, while you're coming up in the elevator to my apartment, in that little slice of waiting time, I've already written an article. It's incredible. He puts every single one of those moments to work.
And this storytelling impulse even seeped into his scholarly work. Most academic writing can be pretty dry, but Eco always told the story of his research, including all his mistakes and wrong turns. That's why even his super smart essays feel like a compelling story.
So, you've got this university professor who suddenly becomes a global celebrity. How did he handle that? Well, the interview gives us some really cool insights into his thoughts on identity and the totally unpredictable nature of fame.
Yeah, There's this great moment where the interviewer says something like, "So you've written, what, more than 20 scholarly books?" And Iko immediately jumps in to set the record straight.
Turns out the actual number was over 40. But here's why that matters. It wasn't about ego. It was about his identity. He famously said, "I consider myself a university professor who writes novels on Sundays." See, in his mind, his real job was being an academic.
So when the interviewer asks the million-dollar question, why did this super dense, difficult historical novel become a massive global bestseller, Iko basically just shrugs. He says its success is a complete mystery. It was all about timing. If it had come out 10 years earlier or 10 years later, he thinks it would have totally bombed.
And that really leaves us with a bigger question, doesn't it? If a genius like Umberto Eco couldn't explain his own success and just chalked it up to mystery and timing, it makes you wonder, what's that secret ingredient, that little bit of magic that makes any story truly connect with us?